The centenary of the First World War was a strong reminder to all of the nations that were involved, all over the world, of the terrible past they had faced together, and each of them commemorated the anniversary with public condolences, celebrations, and other remembrances. But there were still traditions and national characteristics that determined the importance of remembrance in their respective cultures. One example. For the events during the anniversary 2014-2018, Australia spent approximately $552 million. That is 5 times more than the United Kingdom spent, and 92 times more than Germany spent. Now, why is there such a difference? Why does commemoration differ so much between countries that fought in the same conflict? The Great War was truly a world war, with global consequences not only for its time, but for generations to come. Nevertheless, it seems often easy to overlook things like the fact that soldiers from 23 nations took part in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Each and every one of them experienced the war in his own way, and those who survived brought those memories back home. Tales of bravery, of hardship, of loss and victory, of conviction and disillusion, they all found their way into the public memory of countries as far away from the battlefields as New Zealand, Senegal, Canada, and India, to name a few. And it is fair to say that every country commemorates its sacrifices in the Great War differently and in its own cultural way. Commemoration is collective remembering, and that remembering is shaped by how societies turn private experiences into public ones. Former individual memories are expressed through open dialogue, not only with former brothers in arms, but civilians, bystanders, and objectors alike. On a national level, the most influential media of exchange are books, movies, biographies, and documentaries through which the collected experiences are presented in a cultural context. But those can really differ from nation to nation. The Armistice of Compiègne on the 11th of November 1918 is usually the date in Western memory that the Great War had ended and peace finally returned, as that was the date the last of the 4 Central Powers stopped fighting. Soon, all along the Western Front, from the Belgian shores to the high mountains of the Vosges near the Swiss border, the guns went silent, and soldiers were able to finally escape their dismal lives in the trenches. In Paris, London, and New York, huge crowds of ecstatic people celebrated, and the victory parades marched. Over 4 long years of struggle were somewhat suddenly over, and a return to a normal, quiet life was finally here. Demobilization began almost instantly. Well, it was foremost in people's minds. Not only would the fathers, sons, and brothers return, but they would return as victors over the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, the Bulgarians, and the Ottomans. The Australian national consciousness was forged on the shores of Gallipoli. Canadians stormed up the ridge of Vimy and came down as national heroes. Likewise, Indian soldiers in Mesopotamia, Senegalese shock troops in France, or New Zealanders in the mud of Flanders. The Entente would not have withstood the might of the Central Powers without the mobilization of its colonial and Dominion forces. At the same time, those countries on the periphery of the battlefields of the Great War earned themselves a collective memory that would soon be integrated into an emerging national identity. The Australian soldiers that went to Gallipoli became the symbol of what it was to be Australian. Courage, endurance, sacrifice, and mateship, traits that were essential to survive the life in the trenches, became part of the national identity. It took only a short time until the fighting on the beaches of Gallipoli took on mythical status, becoming the place where the Australian nation gained its birthright. It evolved into a narrative of heroism that resonated well with the people back at home, far better than simply the end of the Great War did. The war memorials that were erected were not only a tribute to their nation and the larger picture of king and empire, but to the individual warrior, the citizen soldier. He was both victim and hero, but still an individual in an ocean of hundreds of thousands of the dead. Throughout the 20th century, this image persisted, with the Second World War adding yet more heroism to the concept of what it was to be Australian. The memory boom in the 1990s reinvigorated the commemorative effort in Australia, but it also did in places like Turkey and France. In Australia, Gallipoli remained the main focus of the centenary, with the politicians, the mainstream media, and tourist and military agencies actively sponsoring the event. and thereby cementing its place in public memory, serving as a tool to connect the various cultural groups of Australia to a common heritage. By contrast, Turkey, which was created following the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, only relatively recently started commemorating the same event. The memorial to the Çanakkale martyrs was only completed and opened in 1960. Gallipoli had not been thought of as being essential to the Turkish national identity. After all, it was a somewhat Pyrrhic victory in a war the empire lost. The Turkish War for Independence was seen as far more significant. But beginning in the 1990s, the remembrance of the Great War returned to the focus of the Turkish historiography as the country re-evaluated its own identity. None other than Mustafa Kemal, who symbolizes both the memory of the struggle of the Great War and the War for Independence, became the iconic figurehead of the victory at Gallipoli. Larger and more imposing statues were built on the old battlegrounds, and trenches were redug for touristic purposes. But with the re-emergence and re-remembrance of the great Turkish victories at Gallipoli and Kut el Amara, Turkey also opened itself up to criticism over highly controversial and debated topics such as the genocide of Armenians and Assyrians. And the political as well as religious influence of the commemoration raises concerns with international spectators. Those concerns will remain a challenge to the Turkish commemoration efforts for the future. For France, the commemoration of the Great War has always been a confrontation with its Franco-German history. Eastern France was devastated by the war. Villages were razed to the ground. Fields and farmland were torn apart and harbored millions of dangerous unexploded shells. But already, towards the end of the war, various initiatives, sponsored by political, military, or even tourist or clerical associations, were evaluating the battlefields for commemoration purposes. From Arras to Saint-Nazaire, Artois, and Verdun, the French commemoration began turning the old fields of war into memorials very early on. The government hired artists, sculptors, and masons to carve the deeds of their soldiers in stone, marble, or bronze. The initial pilgrimage of families to the war graves of their relatives soon turned into huge crowds of visitors that walked the battlefields out of curiosity of what trenches and dugouts actually looked like. The memorials and commemoration events were created to serve both groups, to teach history and to serve as a physical place of remembrance. And throughout the 20th century and until today, even through the hard times of the German occupation in the Second World War, the commemoration of World War I never ceased. The centennial not only reinvigorated those acts of remembrance, but further cemented this long timeline of tradition. From the hand clasp of Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand in front of Verdun in 1984, to the embrace of Joachim Gauck and François Hollande on Hartmann's Willerkopf, the remembrance took part in a strong Franco-German context. Although both countries cultivate different acts and traditions of remembrance, the centennial shows that these different approaches work well together. Australia and Turkey, France and Germany, countries that define their commemorative effort differently. They were old antagonists, bound by a common history rooted in the Great War, and even 100 years after the conflict, in the era of public remembrance and memory boom, and despite unique national traditions, they join each other in commemoration. This was just one of the topics that are going to be covered at the Win Peace Conference in Berlin in October 2018. If you're interested in the conference, you can check it out at win-peace-conference.berlin.